The morning air at Arlington National Cemetery was crisp, almost unnaturally still. A sea of people lined the marble walkway leading to the tomb of the unknown soldier, their whispers drifting like smoke through the chilly air. Reporters adjusted their cameras. Veterans stood proudly in their uniforms. Children clutched tiny flags. It wasn't just another ceremony. The King of England himself was about to arrive. A sudden wave of black cars rolled through the gates. Security fanned out instantly. King Charles emerged in a perfectly tailored suit, his polished shoes tapping sharply against the stone. His entourage followed, cloaked in formality and self-importance. The crowd leaned forward as he approached the tomb guard, a lone figure standing motionless before the sacred monument. The guard, Sergeant James Miller, hadn't moved a muscle in over an hour. His rifle gleamed under the rising sun. His eyes were fixed ahead, unwavering. He wasn't looking at the king. He wasn't looking at anyone. He was standing for something far greater than himself. The king stopped just a few feet away. He studied Miller like a man inspecting a statue, a faint smirk forming at the corner of his mouth. Then, with a voice that carried the weight of centuries of monarchy, he said, "Kneel, and show respect to the crown." The crowd froze. A ripple of shock spread through the front rows. Some thought they'd misheard. Others covered their mouths in disbelief. Veterans stiffened. Reporters scrambled to hit the record button. Miller didn't move. He didn't blink. He stood like a pillar of iron, forged in silence and discipline. The king tilted his head, almost amused. He repeated, louder this time, "I command you, kneel." Every heartbeat in the courtyard seemed to echo off the marble. A child's small voice broke the tension from the front row. "What's he gonna do, Mummy?" But Miller already had his answer in his stillness. Slowly, with deliberate precision, he shifted his weight, brought his rifle to a sharper angle, and locked eyes with the king. No words, just an unshakable gaze that carried the weight of every soldier who'd fallen and every oath ever sworn. The crowd held its breath. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. The world expected obedience. The narrator whispers, but what they saw instead was honor. Long before that tense morning at Arlington, Sergeant James Miller's story began far from marble courtyards and silent crowds. He grew up in a small town in Ohio, the son of a factory worker and a nurse. He wasn't born into privilege or power. What shaped him was duty, a quiet, unwavering sense of responsibility passed down by his grandfather, a World War II veteran who used to say, "Honor isn't something you say, it's something you stand for." After high school, Miller enlisted in the U.S. Army. He wasn't chasing glory, he simply wanted to serve. But service quickly turned into sacrifice. On his second tour overseas, during a tense mission in a conflict zone, Miller's best friend, Corporal David Ramirez, was caught in an unexpected ambush. Miller tried to pull him to safety, but the explosion came too fast. Ramirez's dog tag was the only thing that made it back. For months after, Miller carried that tag everywhere. He blamed himself. He replayed that night in his mind until silence became his only refuge. But it was during his rehabilitation period that he first visited Arlington National Cemetery. Standing before the tomb of the unknown soldier, he felt something he hadn't felt since that night. A sense of purpose. He applied to join the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, also known as the Old Guard, responsible for guarding the tomb. It's one of the hardest positions to earn in the military. The training is brutal. Exact steps, precise turns, flawless discipline repeated until it's etched into muscle memory. Guards march in any weather. Blizzards, storms, blistering heat. They do not speak. They do not flinch. Miller passed every test, every drill, not because he wanted a title, but because he wanted to honor those who couldn't stand anymore. Over the years, he became known for his stone-like composure and laser-sharp precision. Fellow soldiers respected him. Tourists admired him. But for Miller, every step before the tomb was a silent conversation with his fallen friend. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, King Charles was preparing for a high-profile diplomatic tour of the United States. The royal visit was meant to strengthen historical ties between the two nations. Behind palace doors, advisors and media strategists worked meticulously to shape every moment. This was to be more than a political visit, it was a performance of legacy. King Charles had grown up under the shadow of monarchy, groomed to command respect wherever he went. For decades he'd walked into rooms where people bowed, curtsied, and lowered their gaze. It wasn't arrogance to him, it was tradition. And he expected that tradition to follow him, even on foreign soil. One of the scheduled stops on his tour was Arlington National Cemetery. His advisors considered it a symbolic gesture, a respectful nod to American sacrifice. Cameras from around the world would be present. It was planned as a solemn, polished event. But behind the scenes, A few aides close to the king whispered of his growing frustration. Everywhere we go, we bow to their customs. When will they show deference to the crown? Whether it was ego, habit, or strategy, Charles decided that his stop at Arlington would carry a personal touch. He wanted to assert his presence to remind the world that royalty still commanded obedience. The setting itself couldn't have been more powerful. Arlington National Cemetery, stretching over 600 acres, is not just land, it's sacred ground. Row after row of white headstones ripple across the hills like silent soldiers standing in formation. Each stone carries a name, a rank, or sometimes no name at all, just the weight of sacrifice. And then, at the heart of it, stands the tomb of the unknown soldier, guarded 24/7 since 1937, even during hurricanes, even during national crises. The guard has never abandoned their post. It's a living symbol of eternal vigilance and unbroken respect. For many Americans, the tomb is more than a monument. It's a promise that the nation will never forget those who gave everything, even if their names were lost to history. So when news broke that the King of England would be visiting the tomb, public interest exploded. Reporters from around the world secured their spots days in advance. Veterans arrived early, wearing their medals with quiet pride. Families with children came to witness history. The atmosphere was electric, a blend of reverence, curiosity, and unspoken anticipation. As the royal motorcade approached, Miller stood at his post. He had done this hundreds of times, yet today felt different. There was a tension in the air that even his rigid training couldn't ignore. He adjusted his grip on the rifle, every movement precise and rehearsed. Nearby, military officials reviewed protocol. The guard will not break formation. The king will approach the ceremonial line. He'll place a wreath. There will be silence. No interaction. One officer briefed. It was supposed to be straightforward. But in another corner, the king's aides were giving their own instructions. His Majesty will address the guard directly. Cameras must be ready. Capture his authority. One whispered. Two worlds, two traditions, two forms of respect were on a collision course. By the time the king stepped onto the marble courtyard, the stage was perfectly set. A veteran soldier carrying grief and discipline like armor. A monarch carrying centuries of expectation and power, and a location steeped in silence that tolerates no spectacle. No one knew it then. But in just a few minutes, these three forces would collide in a way the world would never forget. The sharp crack of boots echoed across the marble courtyard as the royal motorcade slowed to a halt. A hush swept over the gathering. Every head turned toward the main pathway where King Charles, surrounded by his entourage and security detail, began his deliberate walk toward the tomb of the unknown soldier. Reporters raised their cameras. Veterans instinctively straightened their backs. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. And there, at the center, stood Sergeant James Miller, motionless as ever. He was a living monument, shoulders squared, rifle at his side, eyes fixed forward. In that silence, every inch of his posture declared, "This ground is sacred." The king's polished shoes tapped rhythmically, the sound growing louder with every step. At first he maintained a dignified composure, hands clasped behind his back, chin slightly raised. But as he neared the ceremonial barrier, the invisible line that no visitor crosses, a subtle shift happened. His stride slowed. His gaze lingered on Miller, studying him like a commander sizing up a soldier. The ceremony began with the wreath-laying ritual. A soldier presented the wreath, which the king carefully placed before the tomb. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts. The crowd murmured softly. For a moment, everything followed protocol. But then, Charles stepped closer to the line, just half a pace at first. It seemed minor, almost accidental. But to trained eyes, it was deliberate. Miller didn't move an inch. A reporter whispered, "Did he just cross the mark?" An officer nearby frowned, hands tightening behind his back. The king lingered there, peering at Miller, clearly testing the boundary. He turned slightly toward his entourage and remarked, not loudly, but enough for nearby microphones to catch it, "Remarkably rigid, aren't they? Like statues." The comment drew a few awkward chuckles from some aides. Others looked uneasy. Then came the second step, closer. Now the king was right up against the ceremonial line. Security shifted nervously. A U.S. military official discreetly motioned for him to step back. But Charles waved him off with a casual flick of the hand. The crowd's mood shifted. Families with children leaned forward. Veterans crossed their arms, recognizing the subtle breach of protocol. And through it all, Miller remained absolutely still, not a twitch, not a blink. His silence was heavier than words. The king tilted his head, almost amused, as if waiting for a reaction. When none came, he took a third step forward, finally crossing the invisible line altogether. Gasps rippled through the audience. One veteran muttered, "He just crossed it. He crossed it." Reporters zoomed their lenses closer. Smartphones lifted into the air, live streaming to thousands. Social media comment sections began to ignite in real time. Is this happening? He's testing the guard. This is gonna blow up online. The king slowly circled to Miller's side, his gaze unwavering, his presence now an intrusion in a sacred space. Does he not speak? The king asked aloud, projecting his voice for the crowd to hear. I've spoken to statues with more response. A ripple of nervous laughter spread, mostly from the entourage. But the veterans and officers in attendance didn't find it amusing. To them, this wasn't entertainment. This was sacrilege. Miller's jaw clenched slightly, a barely perceptible reaction. But for a guard trained to remain still through storms and funerals, that tiny movement spoke volumes. The king wasn't done. He turned toward the crowd, lifting his hands in mock command, half smiling as if he were on a stage. In my country, he declared, the guard kneels to the crown here. Let's see how far their discipline goes. A murmur swept through the spectators. Some gasped, others instinctively raised their phones higher. The king now stood directly in Miller's personal space, his polished shoe just inches from the guard's boots. Security began subtly shifting positions, aware that this was unplanned territory. A little girl near the front, holding an American flag, whispered to her mother, "Mummy, why is he doing that?" Her mother didn't answer. She just stared uneasy. As the tension thickened, several veterans began muttering among themselves. He's crossing the line. This isn't just disrespect, this is a challenge. The guard won't move. He can't. And indeed, Miller didn't. His training demanded it. But there was something else too, personal conviction. He wasn't just obeying a rule. He was standing for every unknown soldier beneath that marble. The king stepped even closer, now eye to eye with Miller. Cameras zoomed in so tightly that you could see the reflection of the king's gold buttons in Miller's polished rifle. "Kneel," Charles said softly, almost like a private order between two men. "Show your respect." The courtyard fell into a strange, electric silence. No coughs, no camera clicks, just the sound of distant leaves rustling in the wind. Miller's heartbeat pounded in his ears, but his body remained frozen in absolute discipline. His eyes, fixed forward, didn't even acknowledge the king's presence. And that's when the mood of the crowd shifted at first. There was confusion, then tension. Now, there was a sense of quiet defiance growing among the spectators. Veterans straightened, reporters lowered their voices, even the children sensed something monumental was unfolding. The king took a final step to Miller's shoulder, leaning in slightly. His voice was firm, edged with royal command. "I command you, kneel before the crown." It was the line no one thought he would actually cross. An audible wave of shock swept through the crowd. Some gasped loudly. A few shouted no. Security tensed. Officers exchanged urgent looks. But Miller didn't move. He didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't turn his head. He simply stood his ground. The weight of his silence became thunderous. Reporters began narrating live. "This is unprecedented. The king is demanding a tomb guard kneel." This could cause a serious diplomatic backlash. Social media streams exploded with Millions began tuning in live. Clips spread across platforms with captions like "He's testing the tomb guard." And the moment that stopped Arlington, what had started as a ceremonial visit, was now a global moment of escalating tension. By now, the officers stationed nearby were in a dilemma. Any interference might be interpreted as disrespect to the king, but any further encroachment could be seen as an insult to the tomb itself. The only one who showed no confusion was Miller. His stillness was now more than protocol, it was a shield. Some men speak loudly, the narrator says softly, others speak through silence. The crowd understood it. Veterans began to murmur in admiration. "Look at him, he's not backing down." Children stared watching history unfold before them. The king, now visibly irritated, stepped back half a pace, frustrated that his command was met with immovable silence. "He's pushing too far," whispered an aide nervously. But it was already too late. The line had been crossed. The tension was at its breaking point, and in the next moment the king would make a move that would change everything. For a moment, it seemed like the king might retreat. He'd taken his step back, his expression caught between frustration and disbelief. The crowd's eyes were locked on him, waiting to see if this was the end of the uncomfortable spectacle. But then, something shifted in his posture, a subtle tightening of the jaw, a flicker of determination in his eyes. He wasn't finished. Charles glanced at his entourage. A few aides exchanged nervous looks, silently begging him to step away. But the king had spent a lifetime in rooms where no one dared tell him no. His ego, sharpened by decades of reverence, couldn't tolerate being ignored in front of cameras. He turned back toward Sergeant James Miller, closing the distance between them again. His polished shoes echoed sharply against the marble, each step like a challenge. The crowd stirred uneasily. Veterans muttered. Reporters whispered frantically into their microphones. Everyone could feel it. The line was about to be crossed in a way no one had ever imagined. The king moved directly to Miller's side. Inside the ceremonial line, this was already a massive breach, but what came next would send shockwaves around the world. He slowly lifted his gloved hand, placed it firmly on Miller's shoulder, and gave it a light, almost dismissive pat, as if testing whether this statue was real. The courtyard erupted with gasps. He touched him. Someone whispered in disbelief. "Oh no, you never do that," a veteran muttered. Touching the tomb guard on duty is considered one of the most disrespectful acts imaginable. It's not just a personal boundary, it's a violation of the guard's sacred duty. Miller's mind, trained for years to respond to exactly this kind of breach, snapped into action. But it wasn't emotional, it wasn't personal, it was precision. His left hand tightened on the rifle. His boots shifted, sharp, mechanical. In one fluid motion, he brought the rifle to port arms, stepping forward in a powerful, rehearsed movement. The sound of his boots striking the marble echoed like a gunshot. "Halt!" His voice was commanding, thunderous, cutting through the cold morning air like a blade. The king froze, his hands still hovering awkwardly in midair. "Do not cross." Every syllable hit like a hammer. For a few seconds, absolute silence fell over Arlington. Even the clicking of cameras stopped. The king blinked, stunned. He had spent his life commanding rooms with his presence, but here, before this silent soldier, his authority meant nothing. The crowd was in utter shock. Veterans stood ramrod straight, eyes gleaming with respect. Children gripped their parents' hands. Reporters lowered their voices, sensing they were witnessing something that would be replayed for decades. The rifle gleamed beneath the morning sun, perfectly positioned in front of Miller's chest. His stance was wide, balanced, unshakable. He wasn't acting out of anger. He was executing centuries of tradition with surgical precision. The king took a half step back, visibly startled. His entourage rushed forward, whispering urgently. Royal security tensed, unsure whether to intervene. U.S. military officers subtly moved into position, not threatening but clearly establishing control of the situation. "Stand down," one officer said calmly to the royal security. "He's doing his job." The words "his job" landed like a gavel. The camera flashes resumed faster than before. The moment was being captured from every angle. Live broadcasts cut to split screens showing Miller's face, the king's shocked expression, and the silent crowd. Commentators began whispering over the footage. "I've never seen anything like this. This will cause a diplomatic earthquake. The guard is within his rights. He's enforcing the line." On social media, clips of the confrontation exploded. Hashtags like #TombGuard, #StandForHonor, #Unshakable started trending globally within minutes. The king, realizing every camera in the world was now on him, tried to recover his composure. He adjusted his jacket, forced a tight smile, and gave a half-hearted laugh, pretending the moment was light. "Very well," he muttered under his breath. "Very well." But the damage was done. The world had seen the moment when royal command met American discipline and faltered. The guard, without saying another word, stepped back into position, returning to his original stance. His movements were crisp, practiced as if nothing had happened, but the energy in the courtyard had shifted completely. The crowd began to applaud softly, not loud, not chaotic, just a slow, rising wave of quiet claps, mostly from veterans and soldiers in attendance. It wasn't for the drama, it was for the principle. He stood his ground, an old veteran whispered. Wiping away a tear, a child pointed toward Miller and whispered to his mother. "He didn't move, Mummy. He didn't move." The king glanced around, realizing that the crowd wasn't reacting to him anymore. Their eyes, their applause, their respect were directed entirely at the silent soldier. Royal aides quickly whispered, "Your Majesty, perhaps we should proceed." There was a flicker of irritation in his eyes, but also something else, recognition. This wasn't his domain. He gave a curt nod and stepped. Back behind the ceremonial line, Miller returned to his stone-like stillness. But inside he felt something stir, not pride, not rebellion, but a deep sense of duty fulfilled. He hadn't acted for applause. He hadn't acted against a king. He had simply protected the sanctity of the tomb, the way he'd been trained to do, the way every guard before him had done. One man spoke, the other stood, and the world listened. The narrator whispers. The cameras zoomed out. capturing the king standing behind the line, the guard resuming his post, and the crowd caught in the gravity of the moment. The turning point had arrived, and the story would never be the same again. The tension hung over Arlington National Cemetery like a storm cloud refusing to break. Cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every subtle expression: the king's rising frustration, the guard's unwavering discipline, the crowd's collective breath held in suspense. King Charles had stepped back behind the ceremonial line, but the moment of defiance had already been immortalized. It wasn't just on the screens of journalists. Smartphones and live streams were circulating the footage worldwide. Within minutes, social media platforms exploded with hashtags: #TombGuardStands, #HonorOverEgo, #AmericanValor. Clips were shared thousands of times before anyone could blink. The king's aides whispered urgently, "We need to move forward, proceed to the next part of the ceremony." But even their words couldn't erase the embarrassment written across his face. For decades he had been accustomed to commanding respect, yet here, in the heart of America, before cameras, veterans, and ordinary citizens, his authority had been quietly but unmistakably challenged. Meanwhile, Miller's role remained the same. He had not sought recognition, had not moved for applause. He simply returned to his post with absolute precision, rifle at his side, boots squared, eyes forward. But the symbolism was clear. Discipline had overcome arrogance. The crowd began to murmur, softly at first, then louder. Veterans nodded to one another. A reporter whispered into her microphone, "I've never seen anything like this." He didn't even flinch. Not once. Even the king's closest aides could sense the shift. The world wasn't watching him. They were watching the guard who refused to bend. The political implications were enormous, and every advisor knew it. A misstep could ignite diplomatic tension. Then, almost instinctively, security stepped in, but carefully, not to confront the guard, but to ensure the king's path could continue without further incident. The subtle choreography was a testament to American military discipline. Contain the situation, protect the sacred, respect the visitor. The king's expression darkened. He realized that his attempt to assert authority had failed in front of millions. What was meant to be a symbolic gesture of royal respect had backfired spectacularly. Charles had underestimated the power of silence and duty, a lesson drilled into guards for generations. At that exact moment, the cameras caught a subtle but powerful detail: the guard's dog tag, glinting under the morning sun, a silent reminder of the friend he had lost overseas. It wasn't just discipline, it was personal honor manifest in stillness. Every inch of Miller's posture screamed loyalty, not to a king, not to a crowd, but to a principle, the sanctity of the tomb of the unknown soldier. The crowd reacted almost instinctively. A slow clap began, first among veterans, then by ordinary spectators, swelling into a unified wave of admiration. It wasn't mockery, it wasn't rebellion, it was respect earned in silence. Children pointed, some with tears in their eyes. Parents whispered explanations. "That man is showing us what it means to stand for something bigger than yourself." Even the press struggled to narrate the moment adequately. Live commentators were caught mid-sentence, stammering in awe. "I don't know if I've ever seen a display of pure discipline like this." Social media erupted further. Short clips went viral instantly. "Guard stands tall against king and honor above all," trending worldwide. Millions watched, reposted, and commented. The story would dominate headlines for days. Inside the ceremonial courtyard, the king realized his miscalculation. His attempt to command had been neutralized by protocol, training, and principle. His aides urged calm. Security remained vigilant, but non-confrontational. Diplomats in the crowd understood the significance. This was a public lesson in American resolve. And then, as if the world itself had exhaled, Miller slowly returned his rifle to his side, resuming his iconic stance at the tomb. Nothing had changed outwardly, yet everything had shifted. Order had been preserved, respect had been asserted, authority had been quietly, powerfully redefined. The king, now composed but humbled, nodded slightly. His royal visit would continue, but the lesson was clear. Some ground bows to no crown. Some moments demand more than words, more than gesture, they demand steadfast honor. The footage of this confrontation would go on to inspire millions. Analysts dissected it as a masterclass in discipline under pressure. Veterans shared it, saying, "This is what we fight for." Children mimicked the guard's posture in playgrounds. Teachers used it as an example of courage, respect, and standing firm for principles. In that moment, Sergeant James Miller became a symbol, not of defiance, not of nationalism, but of honor realized in absolute stillness. The king had made his demand. The guard had given his response, and history had taken note. Discipline can speak louder than words. Stillness can be stronger than authority. And honor, well, honor always wins. The narrator as the camera pans over Arlington's rows of white headstones. By the time the king and his entourage departed, the crowd remained silent for a moment, then erupted into a mixture of applause and whispered reverence. The story would live on, not because of royal presence, but because one man had stood firm for what mattered most. As the royal motorcade disappeared down the winding paths of Arlington, a profound stillness settled over the cemetery. The crowd lingered, not in chatter, but in quiet reflection. Many had expected spectacle or ceremony, but what they had witnessed was something far deeper, a lesson in honor, courage, and unwavering duty. Sergeant James Miller remained at his post, every movement precise, every step calculated, as though nothing had happened. But inside, the weight of the morning's events pressed on him. He adjusted the strap of his rifle, feeling the familiar weight against his shoulder. For decades, he had trained to perform these motions flawlessly, but today, the ritual carried a new resonance. It wasn't about drills or protocols anymore. It was about principle defended under pressure. A few feet away, Colonel Peterson, one of Miller's commanding officers, approached. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he gave a crisp, respectful salute. Miller returned it with the precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Yet this one carried mutual understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the courage displayed, the discipline upheld, and the values preserved. From the crowd, a small voice pierced the reverent silence. A child, clutching a miniature American flag, pointed toward Miller and whispered, "You're a hero." For the first time that morning, a flicker of emotion crossed Miller's face. Not pride, not vanity, but a quiet affirmation that his duty had been witnessed, understood, and respected. He lowered his gaze briefly to the dog tag of his fallen friend, tucked safely beneath his uniform. The tag glinted in the sunlight, a reminder that this stand was for the countless unnamed soldiers, whose sacrifices could never be measured. Veterans in the crowd began to nod subtly, some murmuring phrases like, "Is what we fought for," "discipline over ego." The symbolism of the moment rippled further. Too many, Miller had become a living embodiment of the tomb's sacred oath. In one morning, he had reminded the world that courage isn't always loud, that heroism doesn't need applause, and that honor often speaks through silence. Miller's reflection was quiet but profound. He thought of the soldiers he had served with, of his friend lost overseas, and of every guard who had ever stood watch before him. Each had a story, a sacrifice, and an unseen battle fought in the name of duty. Today, he had not just protected a tomb, he had upheld a legacy nearby. Colonel Peterson touched Miller's shoulder lightly, a gesture that carried more weight than words. "You've set a standard today," he said simply. No one needed to elaborate. In that glance, the centuries of military tradition, personal sacrifice, and unwavering discipline were recognized and honored. The child's voice, small but unwavering, lingered in Miller's mind. Hero, he knew the truth in it, not because of the confrontation itself, but because he had stood for something larger than himself. The tomb would remain untouched, the legacy intact, and the story of today would inspire countless others who watched or would watch later. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the white rows of headstones, the serenity returned. Arlington's silence was no longer empty. It was full of respect, gratitude, and acknowledgement of a man who had remained immovable in the face of power. And somewhere, deep within that stillness, Miller felt a subtle, profound sense of closure. He had fulfilled not just a duty, but a calling. For a fleeting morning, the world had seen honor unshakable, discipline absolute, and courage quiet yet undeniable. Some battles are won without force, some victories are silent, and some men stand for more than themselves, the narrator concludes. Miller adjusted his posture, checked the horizon, and returned to the timeless rhythm of the tomb guard. Outside, the crowd slowly dispersed, carrying with them the weight of a story they would never forget, a story of steadfast duty, unwavering honor, and a hero who spoke through silence. The story of that morning at Arlington National Cemetery would echo far beyond the marble paths and white headstones. It wasn't about royalty, it wasn't about cameras, it was about discipline, honor, and the quiet strength that holds the world together. Sergeant James Miller had reminded everyone watching that some victories aren't shouted, some battles aren't fought with weapons, and some heroes don't need applause. In standing still, he had spoken louder than any command, louder than any crown, louder than the world itself. Across the globe, millions would replay the footage, Social media streams, news reports, and commentaries would dissect every frame, every moment, every precise movement. But the heart of it was simple. A man fulfilled his duty, without compromise, without fear, without yielding. That is the story that resonates with veterans, children, and anyone who believes that integrity and respect are worth defending. And that is the lesson the narrator leaves you with. Tradition is not weakness. Stillness is strength. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands quietly, unwavering, in the face of power. If this moment inspired you, if it reminded you of the power of honor, the value of discipline, and the strength of standing firm, then share this story. Let the courage of Sergeant Miller reach others. Subscribe to witness more stories where ordinary men and women do extraordinary things. And finally, remember, in a world full of noise, there is immense power in silence, steadfastness, and doing what is right, no matter who watches. Because some acts of courage don't just make history, they teach it.